Welcome everybody, welcome to the Foundational Economy Conference hosted by WISERD. So first of all, thanks very much to Jane and her wonderful team for organising the event in terms of the preparation and of course the very intensive days that we've got ahead of us. So this is the first day of our conference and we started this morning with an excellent session with Hilary Cottam, focusing on big questions about what's a good life, what's a good working life, how does work fit together with all of those other aspects of life. So we touched upon all kinds of things around organizations, community, connections, alliances, but also one of the key themes this morning was around the theme of methods. How do we understand what a good life means to people? How do we make those connections? How do we learn things? And I think that makes a really nice lead in to this session this afternoon, where our focus is going to be on those issues about how do we research a good life. So not simply how do we understand this notion of a good life and what it means to people, but how do we create that knowledge? How do we find these things out in ways that then lead towards actions and policy in the future? So if anybody missed Hilary Cottam's session this morning, it's your loss, but the good news is that we have made a recording and that will be available on the WISERD website in due course. So if you did miss it, you'll be able to catch up with that, and I would thoroughly recommend it to you. So we have an excellent panel for our session on researching what makes a good life. So we have 4 speakers. We have Angelo Salento, who is going to talk about his perspective in Italy. We have Lowri Cunnington Wynn, who's talking about her perspective from North Wales. Leonhard Planck and Andreas Novy from Austria, though Leonhard's backdrop looks like he's in somewhere a little more tropical than Austria. And we have John Tomaney with a perspective from Northeast England. So we've got 4 different places, but hopefully a lot of very interesting connecting themes. So that's our session for this afternoon. Before I start, just a few housekeeping arrangements. If we could ask for everybody to keep their microphone on mute during the presentations. Just a reminder that we will be recording this event, and that's so that we can make the recordings available after the conference. We will be running the 4 presentations one after the other, and that's because we think there's going to be lots of interesting connections between them. So there's going to be plenty of time for questions and discussion, but if you can just hold on to your questions for now and we'll look at them all together. There'll be 2 ways to ask a question. You'll be able to put your hand up using the function in Zoom, which we'll explain that later if you're not familiar with it, or you can put a question in the chat. So either way, lots of ways to ask a question. Because the session is 2 hours, we've scheduled a 5-minute break between the 3rd and the 4th presentation. So don't worry, you get 5 minutes to rush outside and make some vitamin D before the second half of the session will conclude. There, if you're Twitter users, we've got 2 Twitter hashtags, hashtag foundational renewal and hashtag foundational economy. So do feel free to use that during the afternoon. So once again, thank you very much to the audience for joining us. Thank you very much to our 4 wonderful speakers who've made the presentation, who have prepared their presentations for us this afternoon. So what we're going to do now is move to our first presentation. So our first speaker, Angelo Salento, and the title of his presentation is Inhabiting a Fragile Territory, Wellbeing and the Foundational Economy in Salento. So we'll now hand over to you, Angelo, for your 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Julie. And thanks all the organizers for inviting me to present my research. Today, I'm trying to share my screen, the slides. Let's see. Okay, everything will be okay now. So the research I'm going to talk about is, it concerns the province of Lecce, also known as Salento. This looks really Lecce. Apulia, Southeast Italy, nearly 1 million inhabitants in 96 municipalities. In terms of economics, it can be considered indeed a poor province, as the average per capita income is about 14,500 euros, and the employment rate is around 43%, placed 90th among the 107 Italian provinces. But nobody in Salento would regard this as a poor place, because it is considered by its inhabitants to be a very livable land, for the beauty of the landscape and towns, for the quality of the food, the richness of the material culture, the presence as well of dignified cultural institutions. And these are also the reasons why Salento has become, over the last 20 years, one of the most popular tourist destinations in Italy, particularly in summer. In the new century, however, things are going wrong. Three major crises intersect. The first is the crisis of small firms, mainly in the textile and footwear sectors, after the offshoring towards Eastern Europe started in late 90s. The second crisis is about the foundational provisions affected by the austerity regime, entailing privatization, outsourcing, and shrinking of any kind of everyday facilities. The third, I would say, tragedy is the agricultural crisis caused by the Xylella bacterium, which has almost entirely destroyed olive crops that are a quasi-monoculture, occupying more than 60% of the used agricultural land in Salento. This is not just, of course, an agricultural crisis, but clearly it is an environmental disaster, fueling desertification, and it's also a deep economic crisis affecting the whole rural context. As a consequence of this appalling compound of problems, a demographic decline is also going on. Only the capital, Lecce, with its hinterland, attracts population, while in the rest of the province, depopulation is quite macroscopic. The shrinking of private and public economic activities has deprived the medium-sized towns of their attractiveness, centralizing opportunities in the capital, thus reducing polycentrism. A generation of radical social innovators is growing in Salento, experimenting new pathways, especially in the field of agroecology and food production. But, however, the usual response to crisis is the mainstream mantra of attracting foreign investment, for example, through the creation of special economic zones, and the emphasis on tourism competitivity, which has disproportionately fueled tourist flows and turned tourism into a quite heavy industry here. In this context, the aim of my research is to investigate, first of all, the citizens' point of view in order to recenter policies. Because, as Peter Berger said, those who are the object of a policy must have the opportunity to participate not only in specific decisions, but also in the definitions of the situation on which decisions are based. So this research was commissioned by the local branch of the largest trade union, CGIL, as part of an effort by trade unions to broaden their field of action, including not only terms and conditions of employment, but also the everyday life conditions of workers. In this perspective, the research aims to understand what matters to people. That is, what are the priorities and the expectations of citizens, and also what are the goods and services they feel most dissatisfied and deprived of. So we searched for a realistic, so to speak, picture of Salento beyond the postcard-like representation fueled by tourism marketing. Some technical details. Of course, we could not conduct the research on the entire population. So we selected the 3 towns, different in size and in socioeconomic structure. Lecce, which is the capital with almost 100,000 inhabitants. Casarano, which is a medium town, about 30,000 inhabitants. Former capital of a footwear district, whose decline began in the late 90s. And Corigliano d'Otranto, which is a smaller town of 6,000 inhabitants, still characterized by a strong sense of community and a relatively high number of associations. So we administered questionnaires with multiple choice and open-ended questions to a sample of 750 individuals divided by place of residence, gender, age, and household income. In addition, we conducted 30 in-depth interviews with qualified witnesses, providing insights on the specificities of the context. Please note that the research has been conducted just before the spread of the pandemic, so the results are not affected by the emergency. It's impossible here, of course, to show the full results of the research, but I can summarize the most important points. Sorry, the figures are in Italian here, but translatable files are, of course, available on request. So first, the citizen's perspective reverses, so to speak, the mainstream focus on jobs and income and the rhetoric of competitivity and economic performance. As you can see here, with the exception of the poorest 1 or 2 quintiles households who urgently need income, most citizens believe that improving services is more useful for improving well-being than increasing income. When citizens are asked about the good reasons to remain and to live in the Salento, the answers recall the mainly intangible goods that the historian Piero Bevilacqua calls the institutions of happiness in Italy: food, social ties, the quality of landscapes, cultural heritage. When the question is about what deserves to be improved, citizens refer to public services, cultural institutions and resources, urban spaces. The answers are, however, place-specific to a certain extent. In Lecce, one of the most sensitive topics is the road network. In Casarano, public services and urban green areas. In Corigliano, economic activities. In any case, tourism, which is the primary target in local politicians' preoccupations, is not among the reported priorities. Crucially, when asked which actors can be counted on for the future, people refer not only to volunteers, but also to intermediate bodies and public service professionals who are seen as the protagonists of innovation and guarantors of well-being. When it comes to deprivation, citizens' complaints are mainly about services, which are reported to be even more unsatisfactory than work and income. Work and income here are more appreciated than services usually. This is especially true in foundational sectors where there has been disinvestment and downsizing, such as health. You see health here, for example, in light blue here. Healthcare services, which are in light, in green. Local public transport. Dissatisfaction is particularly acute in places like Casarano, where social ties and a sound associative fabric that could prevent loneliness and disaffiliation are substantially lacking. In such conditions, people convey fear for the spread of crime and feel comfortable in private rather than public spaces. A certain dissatisfaction, is also felt for cultural and social spaces such as cinemas, theaters, and other social infrastructures, with the only exception of those intended for consumption, such as bars, pubs, and restaurants. In Casarano, once again, this dissatisfaction is acute and the town is losing symbolic capital. So these results suggest a number of conclusions. The first, the citizen's point of view ignores the technocratic perspective of competitivity as the key to territorial well-being. Instead, it suggests that development can only be based on a sound infrastructure for well-being. The second point is that the goods and services of the foundational economy clearly emerge as the key to well-being rather than individual income. damaged and lacking, but in citizens' perception, they need renovation as indispensable because they are indispensable for everyday well-being. The third point is that sociality emerges as a paramount element of well-being, as much important as the material side of welfare, but it needs in turn infrastructure and dedicated space, which are currently insufficient. Fourth, public work and intermediate bodies, albeit discredited, still are perceived as fundamental actors for the future well-being in the area. And all of this suggests that renovating the foundational can be the objective of a highly sustainable development. These indications, I think, are particularly important today because Salento is at a crossroads, so to speak. The area is now devastated by the agricultural crisis and is easily tempted by new monocultures. In the primary sector, a renewed monoculture of the olive tree, because dried out olive trees are being replaced with resistant varieties. In the secondary sector, the monoculture of the so-called green economy, with large energy production companies increasingly grabbing land for photovoltaic plants. In the tertiary sector, the monoculture of heavy impact extractive tourism. The alternative is to regenerate this land to make it habitable. Of course, there is no single recipe for reversing the course, but we can think of coordinated interventions which require administrative capacity and community involvement. We have a priceless capital of settlements and artifacts, both inside and outside towns, which needs to be renewed and repurposed. First and foremost, we need to rethink the use of agricultural land, which has been fragmented over the decades, and requires now to be recomposed and used for biodiversity-oriented agricultural production, renewing food chains and leveraging public procurement. Part of the territory, of course, can be reforested, reinventing a forest economy which has been deleted by the spread of the olive monoculture. But agriculture and food production is not the only way. We also need innovation in the providential foundational economy, which has been eroded by austerity. And this is about innovative social and welfare services, lifelong learning initiatives, renovation of housing stock and social infrastructure, highly sustainable mobility and transport systems, community-based energy production and distribution, without forgetting, of course, cultural production, which, though not foundational, is indispensable for a satisfying life. In all these areas, we have a bunch of expertise that cannot be dispersed. What about the so-called tourist vocation of Salento in this scenario? It should not be sacrificed. Instead, we must put it in the right place, so to speak, because tourism has so far mainly benefited large companies, beach resort rentiers, and the fallen noble families whose villas have been restored by the public purse and privately put on tourism. The rest is low-wage casual job and B&Bification of grandparents' houses in the population. On the contrary, tourism can generate income, public value, and long-lasting well-being if it is grounded in a high-quality landscape and a sound socioeconomic fabric. This, of course, is not, I'm going to close, it's not a localist agenda. It cannot be done without the funding and the support of the nation state and the European Union. But today, perhaps the Next Generation Europe funding can support a next generation Salento, so to speak, if we stimulate a leading role for communities and local administrations, as it happened in recent times in Puglia through innovative youth policies. So now the challenge is open, and there's more to come in next year's Foundational Economy Conference, I hope. Thank you very much.
Angelo, thank you very much. That's perfect timing and a really interesting way of opening our session. So you've talked about the place, you've talked a little bit about the data you've collected and thinking about the implications on that. So if those of you in the audience, if you have questions, write them down, put them in the chat. We will come back to your questions later on. But first, we're going to move. So we're moving from southern Italy to North Wales, and we're moving from just before the pandemic to the middle of the early months of the lockdown. So I'm going to hand over now to our second speaker, Lowri Cunnington Wynn from the University of Aberystwyth. And she's going to give us her view from her research of what matters, the North Wales community in the early months of the COVID-19 lockdown. Thank you, Lowri.
Thank you, Julie. Prynhawn da, everyone. And as Julie said, my name's Lowri, and I'm actually a criminology lecturer in Aberystwyth University, which may seem quite far away from the subject that I'm going to be presenting on today, but sociology is my first passion, and my PhD was actually on outmigration of young people from the Welsh Heartland. So really ties in with this research that we did here. So, I mean, obviously, COVID-19 lockdown was a huge bomb in all of our lives, and especially at a community level as well, I think. But more importantly, I think is what's happened at a community level could offer a sort of successful model of development, both in health, environmentally, and socially as well. And this is something that I'll be discussing in more detail as I go through the presentation. The community that I'm going to be talking about today is the community of Bro Festiniog, or if some of you will know of it as Blaenau Festiniog, and the surrounding hamlets of Blaenau Festiniog. So the research we did with Cwmni Bro. I've also worked a little bit with Professor Carol Williams and Julie as well, Gwynedd Council, and of course the community of Bro Festiniog as well. You can see here that I've been frantically Googling pictures of people, and I'm sorry if I haven't used pictures that you like there either. Okay. So a bit of background then. So it's based, as I said, the research on a report from one small town of Blaenau Festiniog and the nearby villages, hamlets, farms and houses in the valley of Bro Festiniog as well. And those of you who do not know or aren't familiar with Blaenau Festiniog, it's an area which has a long history of deindustrialization, with the local slate industry in decline from around the 1890s. And its history is of urban depopulation as well. As I said, my PhD was on outmigration of young people from the Welsh Heartlands, and this is a trend which is intensifying. The leading sectors of the larger Gwynedd economy are publicly funded education, health, care and public administration as well, plus tourism as of course, which has its own issues, which generates export earnings and poorly paid, of course, seasonal employment as well. So although tourism is on the up there, this of course comes with its own issues. And then I've been working quite closely with Cwmni Bro, and Cwmni Bro is sort of a network of social enterprises, and they coordinate around 14 social enterprises in the town of Blaenau Festiniog. And their aims are, as you see on the screen here, to promote cooperation between community enterprises in the area, improve cooperation between community enterprises, charities, voluntary bodies, and public and private agencies operating in the area as well as things like contributing to the development of individuals, as well as to the economic, environmental, social, cultural and educational development of the area as well. And I think what's important with Cwmni Bro is that community is often seen as something which is quite woolly. We have communities of interest, communities of people, cultural communities and so forth. And of course you have this idea of community as something which never changes, this golden age of unmediated change, representing an ideal of what a community is rather than the realities of it. And I think this is what Cwmni Bro are trying to address here, is that, you know, having this strong network of community and social enterprises to try and overcome some of the issues that the community faces. And the community of Festiniog itself is actually quite an interesting one. And this is a quote here from Professor Graham Day. It actually comes from a podcast that he did for the Open University, where he talks about, and it's a huge quote, sorry, so I'm going to leave you to read it, but it's about the differences between these different areas in Wales and how actually slate areas or mining areas especially have some sort of pull, they have some sort of something quite unique about them. And he says here that, I'm just trying to find it, which, and they're quite different from nearby communities, villages, which are more to do with farming, in the atmosphere of the place, the feel of it, the nature. And the fact that Wales is so different has implications for the current development of these communities as well. And I think this is important when we think about community development and this sort of this bottom-up approach, is that all these communities are very unique in their own way, and that it needs, any sort of development within these communities needs to come from that community itself. And this is a great quote here from Professor Graham Day, which really explains that. And there's actually quite a long tradition of community studies in Wales, and especially in Bro Ffestiniog, which are well-written insights into people's lives in particular places. And as I said, in Blaenau Ffestiniog, you have Isabel Emmett's work, and she takes this former quarrying town and she writes about it from the outside perspective and how outsiders see it. And then she talks about what it's like from the inside, and she says it's a strong community with a very real sense of its identity. It's very strongly Welsh-speaking, and she experiments with the idea of community is that people who have grown up more or less spending their whole lives together and know each other intimately as well. And you can see why this sense of belonging is so powerful in that sort of situation. And this is the case that Blaenau Ffestiniog is still relatively self-contained, and it's a somewhat isolated place where a large number of people spend most of their lives living alongside people that they grew up with. And I think Isabel Emmett writes beautifully about this and gives you that inside-outside perspective on it, and about and talks about the nature of community as well. And you know, some of the things that she talks about in some of her work is actually, you see, coming from the study that we did in Blaenau Ffestiniog during COVID-19. And I'm just going to leave this part of the presentation by giving you a quote from Cwmni Bro Ffestiniog, who say the responsibility for our future lies largely in our own hands. There is an opportunity in this area to create an environmental, economic, social, cultural and educational future based on the best in our cultural heritage. We have started to pioneer a way, and now we must act. And this is the opportunity and challenge for us in Bro Ffestiniog. And this is where this research comes in. And pre-COVID, we'd actually designed the questionnaire, which was all about the local economy and community cohesion. However, about 2 weeks before we were set to launch this questionnaire, COVID hit. And rather than throwing the baby out with the bathwater, we thought, right, let's do a study on the impact of COVID-19 on Blaenau Ffestiniog. And so this is the research. So we did an online questionnaire where 244 adults answered it, and it was in May, between May and early June of 2020, so the early stages of lockdown. The respondents weren't representative, they weren't a representative sample, but they do give an overview which includes the linguistic minority of non-Welsh speakers as well. Okay. So, summed up in many responses to the question about why community is important to you, people and place were mentioned multiple times in different variants. So for some, it is specific people, family and friends, while for others, it is the sense of strong connection between people and the positive actions and outcomes that result from that. So we had things like Cymdeithas Clos, which means a close community, and Cymdeithas Cryf, which is a strong community, and, you know, my family live there. Good place to bring up children, living close to family, and pobol just basically means people. So others highlighted the enabling nature of the place, which affects quality of life. So for example, reasons why the Bro is important included these ideas of Cymdeithas Cryf, Cymdeithas Clos, community, and these were really, really important for the people living there, especially during the COVID-19 lockdown. And then you had the importance of community and family as well. When asked about the benefits of lockdown, the first most popular benefit named by 38% is spending more time with the family. And when asked a more open question about the effects of the coronavirus, 63% were worried about missing family and friends and having to be socially distanced from them, when only 28% worried about the loss of income and 23% worried about being unable to work. Now, this was in the very early stages of the lockdown. So things like worry about work, worry about the economy hadn't quite hit yet, and actually probably spending time with your family was quite a novelty at that time. By the second lockdown, I think everyone was pretty fed up, but we need to think about the context of this. But it actually was really important to people and was more important than income. And then you had grounded through attachment to place. So 71% of the respondents didn't want to move away from what they saw as their place in the Fro or in Blaenau Ffestiniog. And this is a high percentage of the respondents and was really important to them. And this is a great little quote from someone here who was on disability benefits and unable to work. And she said that, or they said that, you know, that usually the small talk meant that people asked, what do you do? And this was never a question that they'd had in Blaenau Ffestiniog, you know, what's your work? It wasn't a question that was asked often. And what does Blaenau mean by this idea of community? Well, things like we look out for each other, which means they look after each other, and people are here for each other as well. These were really important notions of what a community is to them. But of course, as I said at the beginning, a community is problematic in that, you know, this isn't Eden. Community comes with friction. There are changes. There are things that happen. And I think in the second lockdown, there were a lot more frictions, and these frictions were much more apparent. Things like disgusted that the parents sending children out alone, others ignoring social distancing, driving and seeing families, and this sorts of thing. Closeness can also mean dissatisfaction with neighbours. So, you know, it's not Eden, and it's important that we remember that community in itself is problematic. And one of the really interesting things that we found was this idea of resilience in economic adversity. Blaenau Ffestiniog has been in the throes of deindustrialisation for a very long time, and economically it is seen as a left behind place, or somewhere that, you know, is economically challenged. And through the pandemic, I think this resilience in economic adversity, which has always been there, really shone through again. Respondents don't attach value to individual economic success, but to community resilience in economic adversity. The community is unique and holds its own despite the neglect and poverty here. Many respondents weren't really thinking about Blaenau in transactional terms. Instead, one incoming English business owner praised passionate people doing amazing work in the town. And the schools, especially the secondary school, are the public institutions which get repeatedly mentioned positively and are praised for the work that they do, a really important community institution there. But this idea of resilience really shone through, and I think this is something that a lot of communities have seen. Those communities who have faced resilience in the past have also being able to weather the storm of COVID-19 because they're used to this economic adversity. I'm rushing through this now, so I see I only have about 3 minutes left. So as I say, resilience in economic adversity, it gave the community a chance to perform little things such as helping with shopping, looking out for neighbours, and only a few mentioned this structured support, such as phone calls to aid well group members and helping with gofal cymunedol senior group. And there were also frequent mentions of the food bank. So this idea that the community themselves were empowered to take ownership, I guess, of the support that they gave to people living around them, that there was some sort of ownership in the help that they gave to other members of the community. 85% believe that people in the community are doing more to help others. As I say, this was in the first lockdown. Things will have changed. Things are changing from week to week, let alone month to month. But 71% report that they as individuals have not received more support during the coronavirus outbreak. So some sort of discrepancies here as well in terms of the data. And what about being more involved in the community after the pandemic? Well, from the responses to this last open question, that it's clear that some will continue to help in the community when the pandemic is over. And this needs to be supported by some sort of new developed structure model, which involves both design at the community level, but also perhaps supported in a way that is supported externally as well as from within the community as well. And what does the data mean? Okay, so Blaine and the Brawl look to be the kind of place which could be condescendingly described as left behind in economic terms, and there are many places in the UK that are described like this. It's got low wages, precarious self-employment, and which is partly buffered by modest house prices as well. But what we see from the data from the questionnaire is that actually they have been able to respond well to a crisis such as COVID-19, and actually that community response, that community level support has been all important. So some closing thoughts. One, I'll quickly rush through this. As I said, it was a questionnaire that was in between May and June 2020, when business failure and high employment were apprehensions about the future. They weren't really present realities. So things have really changed since then. And going forward, what Cymru Bro doing now and ourselves doing now, we're doing a follow-up community questionnaire, and which is happening at the moment, to the extent of the similar different results in later stages of the pandemic's impact on households and the community, which is really, really important. And we can sort of dig deeper here to some of the things that we found. And as a matter of urgency, community has been demonstrated through the pandemic by more helping of others and the valuing of these acts as well. And there's a question about what structures and models can be put into place to encourage individuals to carry on doing more to support their communities. And as that's the title of the presentation, here is one big idea from a small place. Okay, sorry, a bit of a whistle-stop tour there when I rushed towards the end, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please drop them down and I'll attempt to answer them later.
That's excellent. Thank you, Lowri. Perfect timing and a different focus to Angelo's presentation, but I think lots of similarities there in terms of some of the themes that you are picking up. And again, a different way of thinking about this, you know, what makes a good life? How does the community contribute to the notion of a good life? So we now move to our third presentation. And here we're going to hear from Leonhard Plank and Andreas Novy. And the title of their presentation is The Good Life for All and Foundational Renewal in Austria, Breaking Away from Welfare Capitalist Nostalgia. So that sounds like a very robust title, and we look forward to hearing more about how we're going to do this. So over to you, Leonhard and Andreas.
Yeah, welcome, and thank you very much for the invitation and for the opportunity to exchange ideas with the colleagues and others working on foundational economy, and we've been really looking forward for this opportunity. 15 minutes is a very short time, that's why, and we have two speakers, that's why we decided in our presentation to focus on the conceptual implications, and I think that's of the empirical work we have been doing over the last year. And listening to the morning presentation, I think there is indeed a lot of interesting overlaps, and I personally am very happy that we have a foundational economy conference with this strong focus on the good life, because the knowledge alliances that we have been building before foundational economy existed for us as a concept have been very strongly oriented towards alliances of, let's say, green and red, of social justice and sustainability, and trade unions, green movements. And the topic and the concept was the good life for all that we used. We have a website and we had two conferences. I just wanted to mention this because there is a certain continuity, and the institutions that asked us to do a work on die Leistungsträgerinnen des Alltagslebens, on the high performers in the crisis, on foundational workers, and how the crisis impacted on them, were trade unions that were in this Good Life for All alliances for the last years. And you can find this research report on the Foundation Economy website. It's a German report, but it has an English short version. And the key, let's say, the key policy recommendations, they are not really surprising, asking for this sector be of the foundational economy to be evaluated on the one hand, but we perceive that this in itself is not sufficient, and we perceived also in doing this huge empirical work on socioeconomic conditions of these 40% of foundational workers and additionally the overlooked economy, that we have to refine certain concepts, and that's what we will present in the following 10 minutes or a little more. And the argument is mainly that foundational economy can gain a lot from more systematically including ecological and feminist critique. And with respect to the feminist critique and the broader concept of work, I need not say a lot, add a lot, because that has been well discussed in the morning session. And what Hilary presented fits perfectly well with our idea to have this broader, to look at the core economy in our understanding, and how the core economy of non-wage work, of non-monetarized labor, how this relates to the foundational sector, because in fact both sectors are about caring for one another and delivering basic provision. And the second aspect, which increasingly for all of us is becoming central, is the ecological critique. That's why the good life for all definitively has to be lived within planetary boundaries, and this has implications that we are all starting to learn, and which are a key challenge for trade unions especially, and that's why we included this, just I have one data here from Austria that we used in this in our study. 40% of the work in Austria is done unpaid, and it's mainly done by women. And if you look at this table, you see that it reduces even more the importance of the non-foundational economic sector that is so crucial when we're talking about economic policies. But in fact, with respect to work done, it's only one aspect of many others. And this led us to a table, and that's my last slide. That's the simplified table. We have a more complex one, elaborated, but that's not possible in 15 minutes to explain in detail. A table where we adapted the model and the scheme of the foundational economy that many of you might know, and related it to ecological challenges and the debate of degrowth and the necessity that certain activities also have to shrink. And I think the foundational economy is a very rich and very strong theory for these ecological debates, because it allows us, and that was the debate in COVID and the renewal after COVID, to strengthen the foundational sector. And that's why we put here certain sectors that have to expand and to grow, our sectors of the foundational economy, but that has to go hand in hand with other sectors to convert, to change, and even to shrink. And I think this is a very strong argument for political debates, and it's very helpful for the discussions on how of ecological restructuring. And trying to stay within time, I hand over to Leonhard with a few of the results.
Yeah, thank you, Andreas. So as Andreas said, this table, or let's call it a scheme, transition scheme, is also inspired or guided by so-called, let's say, design principles or, well, policy recommendations for each of those different zones. And we have, like, for each zone, kind of one principle that should guide overall action, and that tries to accommodate those two concerns of feminist critique and ecological critique. And it also, well, hopefully at least, offers kind of a joint orientation or a common sort of an abstract map or compass for different or broader alliances with some of the communities that Andreas already touched upon, like degrowth or care communities. So I'll pick a few of them given the time constraint, and start with what's probably the most overlooked or the most invisible one in our scheme, the sector of, or the zone of the core economy of unpaid work. And given its crucial role of sustaining everyday life, and also given the unequal gender relations that prevail within that zone, we would call for problematizing the boundaries that are drawn between paid and non-paid work by highlighting or politicizing the sector of unpaid work. And Andreas already gave a number. This is like a more general from UNDP report, just to give you an idea about the mere importance of unpaid work. It's like 40% of total work time, and 3/4 of them is assumed by women. And to make this contribution to a good life visible, of course, we need adequate metrics. One of Karel's important calls for years, and I think we'll come to that. But we need adequate metrics also for time politics, and we've been talking about this in the morning already, when we talked about reducing wage labor or the wish to work less. But the time politics is also about promoting more equal forms, more equal distribution of different forms of work. And here our scheme or our conceptual ideas were inspired by the long-standing work of a German feminist scholar called Frigga Haug, who developed the so-called 4-in-1 perspective, where she outlines like a vision for socially necessary work, and she differentiates or distinguishes between four forms of socially necessary work: remunerated work, which is mostly assumed or predominantly assumed by men and happening usually in the paid economy; reproductive work, which is primarily assumed by women and happening in the unpaid sector, the core economy, but also importantly for us in the providential sectors, and where women often face double burdens of being paid caregivers, but also shouldering most of the unpaid care work. Cultural work, as the individual self-development, learning, develop one's own idea about what is an active life, what is a flourishing life. And lastly, political work, which should enable the shaping of society, the shaping of one's own environment.
You have to be quicker, Leonhard.
Yeah. And so I'll just take a few of those principles. Just importantly, I think for us and for discussions within the research network is also to problematize the boundaries, also its implications for our foundational livability concept, as we also need to talk about time use is not only about income at the household level. So thank you, Andreas. Moving on to the second one, the second policy area principle concerns the foundational economy, and we're going to hear a lot of it over the next 2 days in more detail. Our broad claim would just be to decommodify, ecologize, and expand these provisioning systems and put priority on the satisfaction of human needs. And this implication, this agenda has the implication that we need to convert unsustainable forms of need satisfaction. So we need not only a central state that enables our local and regional experiments and different forms of coordination at the local or grounded level, but we also need a central state that constrains choices actively and interferes in our choice architecture. And then from that, choice edited structure, we can shape the available options contextually. We can have a lot of different citizen participations to deliver different services and goods within the foundational yeah, public funding is going to be a separate point in the conference, so I'll skip here and we move on to the third zone, which is the overlooked economy, or as we have retermed it, non-essential localing provisioning. Basically providing a lot of comfort goods, but also importantly, as we've been hearing several times already today, important for as local meeting places, such as in cafes or restaurants, and whose importance has been underlined, particularly in places in rural areas, but also in urban peripheries, where their decay or the degradation of those places has led to polarization and a number of problems. We would argue for more work conceptually, also to get hold of the different business models, the different actors within that zone, because we see like a range of well, models ranging from family-owned restaurants to multinationally dominated chains like Starbucks, and therefore we need different conceptualizations and adequate policies to that. The fourth principle deals with the export-oriented market economy, and which is often portrayed as the economy in singular terms. And here the policy recommendation would be, or the design principle would be, to convert and shrink parts of that zone, so to strengthen its serving functions, that is, to treat it as an adjunct to reliant systems. And here there's of course an urgent call to these transformations, different branches in this zone. Just to give you a example of a recent report on the car makers ahead of the International Car Exhibit, which has calculated CO2 emissions for each of the largest car makers. And here you can see that VW is responsible for about 1% of all CO2 emissions globally, which is more or less equal to Australia's emissions. So taking the good life for all seriously within planetary boundaries not only requires shrinking the luxury consumption of certain parts of society, but also conversion of existing systems that are configured in unsustainable ways currently, as for instance the car industry. And one way to strengthen this, or to promote this conversion is, of course, to get rid of the short-termism that we have in much of these businesses. And one practical way would be to think about legal forms that by design have a different logic built in, as we see in some of the foundational sectors. If we take, for instance, Welsh Water, but also in industrial sectors in Germany, for instance, corporations like Bosch or Zeiss have been working on similar models for more than 100 years. This brings me to the last and final design principle, which concerns the rentier economy, which we have separated out since it's basically a zone that is dominated by value takers, as it's based on unearned income, and its rise over the last decade has led to an increased dangerous concentration of economic and political power, as one of the services called a Medici vicious circle. It's not a provisioning system. We would rather term it, along the Fanning and colleagues, as an appropriating system that, in contrast to provisioning systems, does not satisfy universal human needs, but rather is based on rent extraction and for the satisfaction of a small part of society, for the wants of a small part of society, not the needs. So in order to improve overall resource efficiency, human well-being, and to enable a good life for all within planetary boundaries, the recommendation for this zone is obviously to shrink it. I think we're a bit over time, so I'll leave it at this point and look forward to the discussions after the break and after John's presentation. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Leonhard and Andreas. And you were spot on the timing, so that was just great. So it was very nice to hear some of these connections back with the presentation this morning. You brought time. You know, we earlier presentation we talked about place, and you brought the really important issue of time back in again. And you've kind of jumped ahead with some design principles, which is very interesting to kind of reflect on what are the implications of understanding more about what a good life means. So thank you very much to Leonhard and Andreas. What we're going to do now is take a very short 5-minute break, and we will restart at 3 o'clock UK time, in 5 minutes time, with our fourth and final presentation from John Tomaney, who's going back to the community level with his, he got the prize for the shortest title, which is Understanding Sacriston. So 5 minutes and then we reconvene. Thank you, everybody. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I assume everyone's still there. The problem with the blank screens is you don't know whether people are here or not. Okay, so so far in the session, we've had 3 very interesting presentations. We now turn to our 4th speaker, and following that, we will have discussion and question and answer. Do get your questions coming in a little while. So our 4th speaker, John Tomaney, and he's going to talk about northeast of England and some research he's been doing in Sacriston. So I think there should be some nice connections here with our earlier presentations and the theme of understanding a good life. So John, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Julia. Thanks for the invitation to speak. What I want to do today is present some findings from research with colleagues at UCL. It's ongoing research, although we've recently published a report, which I'll reference later. What I want to do is present a story of a village and its historical development with a focus on the notion of social infrastructure. We're interested in exploring the emerging debate about social infrastructure and its link with the debate about the foundational economy. Should I acknowledge our sponsors? Here they are, ESRC, the EPSRC. We've also had support from UCL itself, and this is work which we're conducting with the Durham Miners Association. They're based at Red Hills at Durham. So we've become increasingly interested in the notion of social infrastructure and observed the emerging debate about it. And one very clear expression of some of the propositions that have emerged around this notion of social infrastructure is put forward by Klinenberg in his book Palaces for People, which has attracted a lot of attention. And for Klinenberg, social infrastructure are the physical places and the organizations that shape the way people interact, that contribute to the production of social capital. So a key element then of the built environment, if you like, is one way of thinking about social infrastructure. It can include things like public libraries, schools, playgrounds, parks, sports facilities, etc. These are physical spaces where people can gather and converse civilly in their communities. These physical infrastructures provide the space for associational activities such as sports clubs, play groups, local history societies, and so on. And in Klinenberg's book, he charts the decline of social infrastructure using largely US evidence and concludes that we're only now coming to terms with how much damage deindustrialization and the decline of blue-collar communities did to the body politic, how fractured and distrustful we have become. His argument is that social infrastructure grew up around a particular form of industrial life. As industries declined, alongside that loss of industry was the loss of this social infrastructure. And this is a factor which has led to political and social and cultural polarization. So there's been a growing interest in this notion of social infrastructure in UK debates that we've charted. We could also look at them in other national contexts. Across England, the COVID-19 pandemic revealed health inequalities, food poverty, absence of green spaces, endemic loneliness, etc., which can be traced back to weaknesses in social infrastructure. A poll from Survation, a UK polling company, earlier this year, identified places to meet and other community facilities which bring people together. It's the top priority in left behind places, these places that we've heard already about today. And in this context, we can identify an emerging body of what we might call grey literature emerging from institutes, think tanks, and so on, which are addressing this issue of social infrastructure. Bennett Institute, Center for Progressive Policy. But also it's worth noting that in the US, the Biden plan, the Biden infrastructure plan, includes a strong component of funding for social infrastructure. But what is this social infrastructure? What does it mean in practice? How do we tell the story of its decline in the way that Klinenberg suggests in the US in different national contexts? So, as I said, what I want to do here is report on ongoing work in Sacriston, County Durham in the north of England, to investigate the political history of social infrastructure and its future, that I should say. And this is a story of presences and absences and of gains and losses, which have both physical and emotional aspects to them. So this is the place that I'm talking about. It's Sacriston, County Durham. It's in many ways, I would suggest, an unglamorous and unprepossessing place, but I think looking rather lovely in last winter's snow. And I want to tell this story as part of developing a deeper understanding of this village and places like it. I'm not here really developing any major theoretical insights. It's primarily a story about a village. We've called it a deep place study because we're trying to investigate intensively one place in its historical context and in the range of social and economic characteristics in this place, using a range of quantitative and qualitative methods, the latter including focus groups, archival work, oral history, tracing the development of social infrastructure and the foundational economy in the village from its origins to the present. So the first thing to say about Sacriston is that it didn't exist until the 1840s. It owes its existence to the sinking of a colliery, which was opened in 1839, part of an expansion of the Durham coalfield, probably the greatest deep mine coalfield the world will ever see. And since the second half of the 20th century, we've been dealing with the decline of that coalfield and the implications of it. Here we see a picture of the mine at its peak production in 1920. The work that was done in this mine, which provided almost all the male jobs in the village, was dirty, it was difficult, it was dangerous, and it was periodically deadly. It's a place which produced strong workplace solidarities because of these conditions. But it was a workplace which dominated the village but closed in 1985. And the portrait you see on the right is of the man who was involved in closing the shaft at the pit in 1985, and that's my uncle Gus Tomaney. So the key institution which emerged out of the workplace and into the life of the village was the lodge. That's to say the local branch of the Durham Miners Association, which was formed in 1869. And it was established, first of all, to improve conditions within the workplace, but its influence extended far wider than the workplace itself. The lodge, the miners' union, worked with a range of collective, communal, associational institutions to produce the social infrastructure and foundational economy upon which the village rested. So this is the village. This is the first map of the village from 1857. And we can see the colliery at the top of the screen and the beginnings of a village, small rows of poor quality colliery houses built by the coal company in the 1850s. But also what we see here is the beginnings of social infrastructure. So there's the colliery. We see the emergence of, or the building of pubs, the Sacriston Colliery Inn. We also see the beginnings of what we might call a religious infrastructure. The first arrivals are the primitive Methodists. These are our hardline Protestant sect who became very influential in the trade union and who really saw themselves as doing God's work in forming the union and improving conditions in the village. A national school, built in the 1850s to provide rudimentary education to the children in the village. So from the beginning, what we're seeing is not just the colliery and the village, but and the housing in the village, but infrastructure to support life in the village. And the Primitive Methodist Chapel being an early example of infrastructure which was built by the people of the village themselves out of their own resources. So we see the development of Durham, Sacriston, County Durham, from the 1860s onwards. It's expanded to take on its modern form by 1920. That shape is more or less the shape of the village through until the 1970s, when there's significant expansion of the village around that time, mainly in the form of council house building. And the village has not radically changed its shape since that time. So we can trace the origins of social infrastructure through business directories, such as Kelly's Directory of Durham for 1898. And what we see here is how the rapid expansion of the village, reflecting the expansion of coal production and the demand for labour, is stimulating the development of social infrastructure. So what this business directory tells us is that as the village expanded, so did social infrastructure. And we see that this involves the building of churches, of clubs, of all kinds of things, plus the foundational economy of a retail, the emergence of a retail sector in the village, although these are reported as being shops. In fact, many of them were just rooms in miners' houses at this time. By 1914, there's been a huge expansion in this social infrastructure. So Kelly's Directory for 1914 reports the building of or the existence at least of an Anglican church, a Church of England, a Catholic church, a Salvation Army citadel, a Wesleyan Methodist church, a Primitive Methodist church, a United Methodist church. So you had a wide range of choice of Methodism, a Plymouth Brethren Gospel Hall, a Literary Institute, plus numerous pubs, the Three Horseshoes, the Robin Hood, the Queen's Head, the Colliery Inn. So this is an explosion of this social infrastructure of the type Klinenberg talks about during this period. Much of this built by the villagers themselves. So if we take the Catholic Church, St. Bede's, this was built out of subscriptions from Catholic miners in the village. So there had been mass Irish immigration into the village in the 1860s, and the miners and their families built the church themselves. So an expansion of the of social infrastructure, and a key element of this expansion by 1914 was the creation of the co-op in the village, the Anfield Plain Industrial and Cooperative Society branch at Sacriston, which is marked here. So this is the co-op, a hugely opulent affair at the time, massively raising the quality and quantity of the retail offer in the village at that time. And such was the splendor of this place that there was a report in the Builder magazine in 1897 extolling the range of facilities which was on offer here. Somewhat controversial because it was expensive relatively, and also because it provided competition for other retailers in the village. But it was well supported. In G.D.H. Cole's study of cooperation, which he published in 1944, he shows that the three northern counties of England, Northumberland, Durham, or the four northern counties in his measure, Northumberland, Durham, Cumberland, and Westmoreland, had the highest proportion of people being members of cooperative societies of any part of the country. And probably in Sacriston, the membership of the co-op was probably even higher than the figure reported here by Cole. So this was a coming together of ordinary people to meet their needs through this cooperative endeavour. Another example of the cooperative endeavour in the region was the Durham Aged Mine Workers Homes Association on the main road into Sacriston. This was a housing association established by the miners, because at that point, once a miner finished his work at the colliery, he was thrown out of his colliery house, and so the provision of housing for the elderly was something which was done on a collective foundational basis, if you like. Across the villages of County Durham, this happened. The framework for this was the rise of the Labour Party. And we could tell this story in a number of ways, but I'll tell it through the story of Annie Errington, who, a Sacriston miner's wife. Her husband was a lodge official, a leading figure in the Durham Federation of Labour Women, a mass working class women's movement in County Durham during this period. We think of Durham and the mining communities as male-dominated, which they were in some obvious respects, but there was also a very powerful working class women's movement at this time. Most notably, she visited the USSR to win support for the miners in their strike in 1926. I think by my measure, that's the first time she'd ever left County Durham, as far as I can tell from the archives we have. She was then subsequently elected to Chesley Street Poor Law Guardians, which managed local welfare. She was surcharged and threatened with imprisonment for making overgenerous payments to unemployed miners. But by 1938, she'd been elected to the Rural District Council, the Durham County Council, and appointed a local magistrate or Justice of the Peace, JP. What an extraordinary transformation that had occurred there, from being kind of insurrectionary to a member of the establishment in the space of a couple of decades. And this is the Sacriston women's section parading their banner, I think, at the Durham Miners' Gala in the 1930s. And this was happening across the whole of County Durham, across the whole of the coalfield. The key figure in advancing the labour interest during this time was Peter Lee, who was simultaneously leader of the Durham Miners, Labour leader of Durham County Council, which was the upper tier local government, and also a primitive Methodist preacher. And the Labour Council was Durham County Council was the first Labour Council in England, and it pioneered improvements in water, sanitation, education, public health, hospitals, built council houses at twice the national rate, reduced infant mortality at a faster than the national rate, building the foundational and everyday economy, and achieving massive advances in local living standards. So here's Peter Lee opening the co-op in another village in County Durham, Winnie Hill, and also one of his great legacies, a reservoir in Upper Weardale, which was key to providing clean water to the mining villages, which had generally lacked them until the county council took over the provision of clean water. So the miner, Sid Chaplin, a miner who then became an author and novelist, wrote in 1978 that, reflecting back on the interwar period, each village was in fact a sort of self-constructed, do-it-yourself counter environment. Everything of importance in the village was built by the people themselves. American sociologist Mark Benny, writing in 1946, similarly argues that when you look at these villages, it's the co-ops, the welfare institutes, the clubs that are the outstanding institutional buildings, and nothing has come easily to this village. He talks about this village called East Tantope, which is a neighbouring village. It's an anonymous village, but it's a neighbouring village to Sacriston. When it felt a need, it supplied it for itself. Every institution in the village had been built by the people themselves, or struggled for through their union. So this extensive social infrastructure built out of the village's own resources. So if we look at what the infrastructure was in 1915, we see it's extensive. We see that there's a Methodist church and associated Sunday school. We see the Catholics have built their school, presbytery, and church. The Anglicans come late to the party, but they build a church in the village. There's a Salvation Army citadel, which is another kind of Protestant sect. There's a literary institute. There's a working men's club. There's football facilities. There are additional schools. And also found the local council, the Chesley Street Rural District Council, which was taken over by Labour, starts to provide things like water and sanitation. And then there's the co-op as well. So what we had was this rich social infrastructure built up over these decades, which all, in a sense, came to an end in 1947, in the sense that the coal industry was nationalised. It was no longer privately owned. It was the nationalisation of the coal industry was part of a larger modernisation of the British economy, which involved the centralisation of collective services after 1945 under the Labour government of that time in relation to health, education, utilities, and so on. But the privatisation of those industries and public services after 1979. So this was a period of rising living standards, but it was a period as well in which the state was overtaking responsibility for the delivery of infrastructure and services. Now, these changes were, of course, embedded in and contributed to broader social, cultural, and technological changes, such as the changing position of women in society and in the labour force. But what it meant was that once privatisation and the rundown of key industries and public services, and the closure of the mine occurred in 1986, the village lacked the capacity to respond to this, to the challenges that in the way that it had prior to 1947. So nationalisation led to improvements in health and safety, but also became the mechanism for the rundown of the industry, especially in Durham from the 1960s. Sacriston pit itself was slated for closure on several occasions, but survived until 1986. And that was the last of the inland pits to close in Durham following the miners' strike of 1984-85. So Sacriston, by the conventional measures then, is a left behind place. We see it here marked on this map of County Durham. County Durham's not entirely left behind. We see some affluent places just to the south. These are the communities around Durham, which is a university town, but we see that that deprivation is scattered across what was the old coalfield of County Durham, the red areas. What this means in practice in County Durham is, well, the closure of social infrastructure. So we see here a picture of the co-op closed in Sacriston. We see the classical story, which the British media is very keen on, of a house for sale for £1 in the village. And if you read the local media, Sacriston mainly appears these days as a site of antisocial behaviour and criminal activity of one kind or another. And that's because there is this kind of activity taking place. So in this context, we've undertaken focus groups and oral history interviews to find, what do we find? Well, we find a sense of loss alongside a complex pattern of change. Some of that change is welcome. So from the work that we've done, we find that PIT provided a focus for regional identity and comparatively high-paid employment for many men and relative prosperity in the village within living memory. But associated with a pit closure, shop, pub and school closures feed a sense of decline in the village and a loss of vibrancy. And while it's acknowledged that work, socialisation and childcare were traditionally highly gendered, these did create opportunities for conviviality which are now absent. People recognise material gains such as improvement in housing and so on, and new opportunities for women to work, but this is in the context of a relative decline in living standards and a growing precarity within the workforce. We have a problem of long-term unemployment, entrenching social disengagement, and a decline in what we might call social capital. But like the example of North Wales we were hearing about earlier, there's still a strong sense of belonging and a sense of resilience that was revealed during the pandemic as community groups filled gaps left by austerity in a shrinking local state. But not everybody is connected to this story in the village. There are some new estates. And alongside this, there are problems of isolation and loneliness. And there's a link to the report which tells you this story. So on the one hand, you've got a strong attachment to the traditional identity of the village, perhaps exemplified by the parading of the Sacriston Lodge Miners' banner at the annual Durham Miners' Gala, which is this great celebration of village life in Durham, to which maybe 100,000 people come to parade bands and banners, and is a celebration of the coalfield and its history and identity. But on the other hand, on the edge of the village, you have the building of new housing estates. They're called executive housing estates for some reason. They're building houses which are out of the price range of the existing villages, and they're changing the social makeup of the village. They tend to be located on the periphery of the village, so people come and go from them by car without really interacting with the central part of the village. So what we're doing at the moment is beginning to chart the physical infrastructure, the remaining physical infrastructure of the village, with a view to understanding how it's used and how it might be used differently in the future. And we can do this using the latest sort of the latest land use data. So if we take the example of the recreation ground that we map here, this is the site of Sacriston Cricket Club, which is a very good cricket club, plays cricket to a very high standard, but is much more than that. It was a linchpin in the organisation of the food bank during the pandemic and the lockdowns associated with that. So what we have is this strong sense of identity based around both these organisations, but also around the physical basis, the physical base or the physical infrastructures that they inhabit. And just to conclude, or to move to a conclusion, one very important development is efforts to redevelop the old co-op site as a space for social enterprises of one kind or another. And this is Heather Little, one of the, I suppose in London you would call her a community activist, but nobody uses that language in Sacriston. She's just a local person who's tried to find new uses for the co-op and overcome huge difficulties and bureaucratic inertia to let this happen. Yeah, and one of the enterprises that's in the co-op is this one. It's Woodshed, which is set up by a man from the village to provide employment opportunities for disadvantaged kids in the village. And it's an extraordinarily successful social enterprise, which both makes a living for the people who work there, but provides an incredibly valuable service for the most, what social workers would call hard to reach groups in the village. But this is done in the teeth of all kinds of bureaucratic opposition. So to conclude, well, as W.H. Auden, among others, reminds us, man is a history-making creature who can neither repeat his past nor leave it behind. So we have a past of social infrastructure which is decayed, but the question remains, what can we make of this past? What this story of Sacriston tells us are the opportunities and barriers that exist for the provision of social infrastructure in the village. It certainly highlights the limits of centralized solutions, both in the era of nationalization and more recently, the barriers which social enterprises, which are by far the most dynamic aspects of village life, find when they try to improve life in the village. So that centralized solutions are highly limited. What it tells us as well is about the diversity and complexity of left behind places. They're not the same. They each have their own story, which is why we advocate this deep place approach of trying to understand the peculiarities of particular places. The UK government has a strategy for helping towns and villages, and so does the council, but it runs into the danger of being a strategy of what one conservative thinker has called hanging baskets. She advocates seeing more hanging baskets in villages like Sacriston because it gives the appearance of improvements in life. But what's really needed are much more complex solutions. Questions of identity and belonging loom very large. The groups we've talked to have an intense sense of belonging to the village and a strong sense of identity. Klinenberg makes the point that integrated blue-collar community may no longer be a viable model for large-scale development, but there are many exemplary forms of social infrastructure, some small, some large, some new, which suggest better ways to live and work. And I think in Sacriston, there are some fantastic examples, heroic individuals doing marvelous things, but they're doing it in the teeth of opposition, bureaucratic opposition primarily. They're doing it despite the official world, not because of it. But it suggests that there are great opportunities if we can spread and enable this kind of activity, which was, I think, the term which Hilary was using this morning. So Andy Haldane, recently the chief economist of the Bank of England, has argued that a key policy priority is to strengthen the infrastructure that underpins this social sector, embedding for good the new model army of volunteers that the COVID crisis has spawned. I suppose the people like Heather Little, who against the odds have done great things for their village, and that's me.
That's great. Thank you very much, John. I think you've given us a really nice perspective on a sort of time and place. So the kind of development of foundational economy and social infrastructure in that very particular context, and also the challenge now around the remaking of those things. And I think that connects very nicely with the earlier presentations, which are sort of in a related way concerned with how do we rethink, how do we remake these things that are important in communities. So thank you to all four speakers. We've had 4 fascinating presentations, and we now have lots of time for discussion. So if I can invite people who have questions to either use the, if you look on your Zoom bar and click on reactions, you can select raise hand. So if people want to put their hands up, or if you want to put a question in the chat. And what I'll do is I'll collect a few questions up from our audience and then ask the panel members to come back and respond to whichever of those are the most relevant to them. Okay, so the first person with their hand up is Ian. Ian, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, please. Thanks, Julie, and thanks to all 4 speakers for brilliant presentations. Diolch yn fawr. My question is to everyone, but maybe specifically to John, because he spoke last. But I just wonder, John, is a solution to be found in community asset transfers? And if so, what are the risks of that, particularly in terms of revenue for local, keeping those assets going for local communities?
You want me to answer that one?
I'll just see if I can collect a couple more questions. Anybody else want to?
There are also a couple of questions from Carol.
Okay, right. There's questions in the chat to Angelo from Carol on improving providential services for place and community-based renewal. Should they be top-down and underfunded? And then there's a question to Lowri, but I think, which is in Welsh. So Lowri, you'll have to help us out on that one. And there's another question for John from Carol on rebuilding social infrastructure.
I think the question was, why didn't I present in Welsh? So
oh, okay.
Don't worry about it.
That's fine. So anybody else have a question? Let's tackle those questions first and give everybody else a minute to think of further points. So there was a question for Angelo, a couple of questions for John, and I'll also invite Lowri, Leonhard and Andreas to come in on those questions about how do we pay for services, and this kind of questions around social, the renewal of social infrastructure. Are there particular models like community ownership, as Ian mentioned? So, Angelo, shall I come to you first?
Yes, okay. I have the very difficult question from Karel to reply to. Yes, a $1 million question, but Karel, I could reply to you in a probably embracing a radical degrowth perspective, but it would be quite unrealistic and probably also kind of crypto consolation. Which would be, okay, let's organize all these providential services on the basis of mutualism. But of course, it's not a realistic perspective. So I think honestly that at the current state of our institutional imagination, we cannot do without a sound tax reform, without much more progressive and effective tax system. I think that redistribution, also pre-distribution, should be entirely rethought. Of course, some parts of the foundational economy could be probably reorganized at the community level. For example, some parts of adult care, of children care, some pieces of probably vocational education, some pieces of public local transports, some pieces of housing probably. But apart from this, I think that many providential services need rather more integration in the national standards rather than local autonomy, so to speak, local independence. So they need, I think, a higher national funding, even because we need to increase budgets and also for increasing, of course, for increasing jobs and wages. On another level, I could tell you that I think that the institutional situation in Italy, for example, could be rethought to be much more effective for the reorganization of the foundation. Because, for example, in Italy, provinces have been substantially suppressed some years ago for the sake of austerity. And regions are nowadays far incapable of organizing place-based activities. Anyway, on principle, I think that and I always thought, and I many times written as well, that the foundational economy is not entirely an economy of the territories, of the places. It's a proximal economy. It's distributed in the territories, in places, but it cannot be entirely managed at the local level.
Okay, thank you, Angelo. I think this reinforces some of the interesting questions about the importance of inside the community and outside of the community, and how those two different things can work together. And Luca has added a point in the chat, which Andreas and Leonhard might like to come back to in relation to these other points about the importance of time, because this came through very clearly in John's account, that the community had built its own infrastructure, and clearly that raises questions both about money, but also in the current context about time. Who has time to do this important community work? So thank you, Luca, for that question. And Lowri, I'll let John come in a minute, but Lowri, you want to come in?
I just wanted to add to that, in that this idea of the community asset transfer, it's all very well having amazing buildings that the community own, but actually being responsible for those buildings adds another element to those people for the community having to be responsible for it, and time really fits into that as well. Who has the time to be involved in these community projects? You know, there is this issue with that people are already stretched, and lots of people don't want any more responsibility either. And I think having community asset transfer can be fantastic, but people are definitely a bit more wary about taking over those responsibilities, and perhaps having a shorter working week would really help, or shorter working day would really help in that. But I think communities are a little bit more hesitant about taking over those assets, some of them anyway.
Okay, right, let's keep going around. I'll come to John in order, but let's just give Leonhard and Andreas a chance, if either of you like to come in and comment about this set of issues that are coming out of the questions and discussion.
Leonhard, or just one very quick point. I think what we tried is, by linking the ecological and feminist concern, that in part it's about shrinking, and if we know the deficiencies of the foundational sector, what has to shrink cannot be the foundational sector. So it's really necessary to look at the overall picture. And when we have these discussions, how heavily subsidized the market economy sector is, I think in part that also opens revenues and funding possibilities for the foundational sector. I think that's one thing. And the other thing is definitively reducing working time opens time for other activities, and at the same time once again reduces the time spent in this very resource intensive, and that's therefore climate inimical market economic sector. I think in this sense there is a synergy in linking these issues.
John, do you want to come in at this point? You had a couple of specific questions, but you may also have some other reflections on.
Yes. I think that's the question that Ian, and in a different way, Carol asked about community asset transfers, is partly being answered by Lowri. I think it's, there's great potential in this. And if you look at this through the lens of community wealth building, then there's great potential in this. But of course, in many cases, local authorities in Britain and in other places, the US, etc., have been engaged in fire sales of community assets. They want to be rid of them because they can't support them in revenue terms, and they hope communities will take these things on. And there have been some positive outcomes in this respect, and I can certainly think of some in the places that I'm familiar with, but there have been some disasters as well. So I think there's something to think about there. Now, if we think back to how the social infrastructure was developed in a village like Sacriston before the Second World War, the thing that made it possible was that there was an important and productive and profitable employer in the village. And so much of that social infrastructure was in effect the funding of it was clipped, if you like, from that profit and recycled into the building effectively of a Methodist chapel or a Catholic church or a working men's club or whatever. That source of wealth is no longer present in those villages. In a country like the UK and in all of the countries that we're joining this meeting from, wealth is heavily concentrated in some places and not others. So the rebuilding of the social infrastructure can only occur alongside a strategy of social and geographic redistribution of resources, and that's and then we're into the realms of wealth taxes and things like that. But I see that I don't see these things as either or. I see them as complementary and necessary. And if we go back to the situation, I told a probably rather simple story of how it all ended in the sort of 1945-50 period in Britain, when we went into this era of nationalisation, the creation of a national economy and so on, which David Edgerton and others have written about. And I think there was a kind of missing concern with the local in that national settlement at that time. And if you look back to the great architects of the post-war period, Keynes and Beveridge, both of them were suspicious actually of how it would work out if we handed all the power to the state. So Keynes himself talked about the need for intermediate organisations in the end of laissez-faire. And in the 40s, Beveridge himself reflected on the creation of the UK welfare state and felt that not enough space had been allowed in it for local friendly societies and so on to continue to deliver some of the important infrastructure and services that they delivered before the Second World War. So I think this is why it's important to look at this history, because there are lessons in it, and we have to understand the turning points by which we arrived at where we are today. So the absence of revenue to support these social infrastructures means that they rely in a village like Sacriston on people like Nathan, who runs the workshop, or Heather, who runs the youth group based at the co-op. And if a handful of these people disappear, it completely transforms the picture. So the question is, how do we sustain that? Financial resources are some of it, but also time, as Lowri was just pointing out, time is critical. And the kind of people who are in work don't have the time to contribute to these sort of social enterprises and efforts and so on. And there are knock-on effects when one piece of social infrastructure closes. So one really telling anecdote came from the chairman of the cricket club, who said that when the local secondary school in the village was closed because of falling rolls, but let's not get into whether that's true or not, but that was the excuse given. He said, our principal source of recruitment of young cricketers dried up. And so we now have this challenge, a bigger challenge of maintaining the cricket club, which, as I've said, serves not just as a place where cricket is played to a very high standard, but also provides this much larger social function in the village. It's a real community organisation. So we've got a lot of things to think through here, in my view. And the question I want to ask Hilary this morning from her experiments is, how do we scale these things up? Well, that's perhaps not the right word. How do we spread them out so that there's a rich ecology of these kinds of activities in particular villages and towns and cities? And it's not easy.
Okay, thank you, panel. We can take another round of questions. I'm going to use my chair's privilege and sort of bowl one in at this point. One of the themes this morning was about imagination, and there was some sort of discussion about whether there was and was not sufficient imagination about the good life that people wanted. And this idea of imagination has come through again in the presentations, particularly through Angelo's presentation about communities with monocultures, which was also reflected in Lowri and John's presentations too, to some extent, about how do we reimagine what a good life looks like. And I had a question, which is how do the panelists think we can kind of capture that imagination, and how do we mobilize it? Do we have ways of doing that through the kinds of research that you've all been doing, or is there something missing here about capturing the imagination of communities and regions and then mobilizing it? So that's my question, but I'm happy to take some more. So if anybody else in the audience would like to add a question into this round? Do we have any others?
Yes,
anybody like to respond to John's? Anyone like to add in John's question about scaling up? Luca, yes.
Yes, I was going to write this in the chat, but since you are asking now, I'll do this right away. I have a question for John, but maybe also for all of us in a way. I think that John's presentation, which I liked a lot, also like the other actually, shows in a way that, you know, the FE is key to the well-being of a place. And gives also a lot of hope in the sense that it shows that people can build the FE from the bottom up in certain places with a lot of limit, but that is possible. But I think it also shows that in a way that FE cannot alone sustain a place, because the Sacriston story shows that when the mine goes, the main employer goes, especially in a small place where you have a big prominent employer, the whole local economy collapses, and that's not enough to sustain the FE. So I think this pushes in a way to think also about, you know, other zones of the economies. That is definitely important to focus on the foundational economy, but in a way, if also the other parts of the economy do not work in a different way, this can create problems for the foundation economy and creates problem to the whole community. So yeah, if someone could, you know, elaborate on this point about the independence, which was already emphasized by Leonhard and Andreas about, you know, the foundation economy and the other parts of the economy, and the need maybe for us as a collective also to elaborate a thinking on the other parts of the economy, you know, to make society work better as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Luca. Do we have another question for now? Okay, in that case, let's go around the panel again and see what other comments you'd like to contribute. So Angelo, back to you.
Okay, Julie. Yes, about your question on I would say on aspirations, probably, and capacity to aspire, so to speak, because, you know, imagining a future, a new future implies having a capacity to aspire, and the capacity to aspire is not equally distributed in society. It's a kind of virtue, a kind of skill which is gained through, I would say, social biographic trajectories, which are most of the times intergenerational. But I think that we could rely on, probably we could call them once again the radical social innovators. I mean people who are who have voice capacity and who have a strong capacity to aspire, and they could be probably supported through specific policies for you know, producing new ideas, new enterprises, new initiatives that can then be shared and continued. I think that in my region, Puglia, was in the last decade one of the one good laboratory for particularly policies for youth. And this was a good experiment because there was, for example, a program called Bollenti Spiriti, Boiling Spirits, which succeeded in you know, generating a kind of imagination about what we can do in our future, and a lot of experiments started then. And then this policy was then interrupted by the next government, the regional government, but I think it was clearly a great success. And in a sense, I think that that kind of policy should be repeated, should be reiterated also in other sectors, not just cultural production, youth policies, but also, for example, rural innovation. So a rural boiling spirits campaign should be, I think, one of the next steps of a good regional government. And we of course could think about such policies also in the field of housing, for example, restoring, fixed capital and the cultural heritage, or also in the care sector, and instruments for promoting the capacity to aspire of youth. That's what we need, I think, in this very moment. We cannot invent anything out of nothing, of course, out of the blue, but we can promote the capacity to aspire that many people indeed has got in this region, as well as in every so-called left behind place.
Thank you, Angelo. Lowri, I'm sure there's probably a good Welsh term for capacity to aspire. So how would you?
I mean, mine's more of a general point, really. I just wanted to add in terms of this idea of how we help a community aspire, or how we ignite an imagination, is that actually it's about celebrating uniqueness. So when I think about somewhere like Festiniog, for example, what might work as an economic model in Festiniog might not work in another area. It's about celebrating what that community has to offer and what it can give. So I'm trying to think. So if you think, for example, when Gwynedd Council talks about high value jobs or high income jobs, and those sorts of jobs might not work in an area like Festiniog, but it has its own unique thing to offer, which I think is about celebrating it and giving it its own aspirations, things that also that people can aspire to, that they don't seem too far ahead for people, if that makes sense, or too unobtainable for people. And I think that's really important when we think about firing an imagination, is that making sure that what the community is aspiring to isn't too out of reach for people, isn't too obtainable for people in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to take Leonhard off his desert island and bring him back to, if you'd like to respond to Luca's question, or this issue about imagination, aspiration. What do you think?
Well, I was thinking about a recent film that I was supposed to watch, which was called or entitled Save the Village, which reported, it's a kind of a documentary, 1 hour, which reported on regional development, renewals in Austrian rural regions, like at the very local level, villages, small towns. And one of the town I always like to portray, since it illustrates some of the principles that or some of the mechanisms that we would argue for within the collective, like social license, trying to, for instance, get a local grocery shop or retailer back into the town. That not only comes back one of the mainstream chains, but the local government doing an auction and said, well, we want to have this share of local or regional products within your shelf. So trying to rebuild that kind of economic local regional circuit, or going up with different micro public or semi-public transport schemes that are based basically on private cars, and then people being transported in private cars. So a form of shared local mobility. That's all happening in that one town or village. And it's driven by one mayor, of course, and a couple of other people. So as has been raised, and I think that is common, well, or at least also from the experience that we have here with rural renewal or redevelopment, often the case that people make regions, and it's critical that you have this type, either mayor who's backing up, plus a couple of inspiring persons who are willing to do more than the average person or citizen does in a village. So I think that is kind of a practical example. And I would also ask Andreas, maybe if you want to drop in based on on the conferences that he basically organized on the Good Life for All, if he has more to add on that. But I think especially here, and that comes also back to one of Carol's questions, to the question, or well, on political affiliations, parties, where are the allies? If we look at the local level, at least here in Austria, and I would also make that claim for Germany, there's a very pragmatic, beyond the usual red-green party affiliations concern, and also willingness to work on experiments in innovative forms of provisionings within the foundation. So I think there's a lot to gain, basically, and there's a lot of working examples that we need to probably better connect or portray in our work.
Just one point to add, because I think we have not said it, and I think it's a key consequence of the COVID pandemic that the collective imagination, I think, really got the point that there are some economic sectors that are more important than others, and not everything is equal. I think this is really a key aspect that will stay. The idea that foundational is not something that a few people argue, but is really something that people understand, and the research and the political challenge is to give content to this and to clarify what is foundational and how to strengthen this. But I think the imagination is much more, the collective imagination is much better suited to grasp this. And I think that's not a minor advance over the last 2 years.
Okay, so finally, John, you 2 minutes to make your final thoughts. You just need to unmute yourself.
Schoolboy error. Sorry about that. I find myself agreeing with Lowri again that the key to this is understanding the community, what it wants, and what it's prepared to invest its time and energy in. So this is where I think questions of belonging and identity are really important in all of this. They're not sort of things around the edge, they're absolutely core, and that sort of helps me as well answer what something that Carol raised in the chat, which I didn't respond to, which was what kinds of infrastructures do these places need? I think it's, we have to find ways of helping communities to sort of express their needs themselves, rather than have, certainly in the UK case, what will happen is, the central government will have a national programme for hanging baskets, and you'll compete to get some funds for hanging baskets to put in your village, and it will work, and that's the bottom line there. I'd agree with Angelo that, to me, crucial in all of this is engaging children and young people in it, the extent of their enthusiasm. So one of the things we're doing at the moment, organising at the moment, are focus groups with school children from Sacriston at the local secondary school. They don't have one in the village anymore, but nearby in Durham, to get their sense. And it's in a school which my own daughter has actually worked in as a teaching assistant, she's sort of said to speak to these kids. They have really interesting ideas, and they're really into, for instance, the fact that it was once a coal mining village, because that's what makes it interesting and distinctive, to pick up what Lowri was saying earlier on. So children and young people, I think, are crucial in all of this, engaging them with this issue. And finally, Luca's point, the foundational economy, the great effort that has gone into, highlighting the importance of the foundational economy has been, I think, being really important in rethinking local economic development. It's one of the really big, fresh ideas around in this field. But I agree with Luca that we need strong foundational economies, but they alone cannot sustain a place. Once you have the main employer leaving a place like Sacriston, which was only built to serve that single employer, So I think we do need to think about the links between the foundational economy and the other zones in the zones, the schematic zones that are in the famous foundational economy diagram. We do need to think about the relationship with the tradable sector. And it may be that that doesn't happen at the local scale, but it happens at a larger geographical scale. But we do need to think that that's a weakness which I think we need to pay some attention to. But I would stress that my final point that I want to leave with is the importance of these questions of belonging and identity. I think they're really crucial in this whole thing, and it's material that can be worked with in a productive and progressive way, I think.
Thank you. Right, it's now just 4 o'clock according to my computer, so we don't have time for any more. I want to say a really huge thank you to our 5 speakers this afternoon. I think we've had some really interesting presentations and some very thoughtful reflections in the questions afterwards. So I think we've got a lot out of this session. So thank you all very much. Thank you to everybody who asked questions. So I think I agree, it's been a very, it's been a great session. It's been a really good first day for our conference. Tomorrow is another day. So we've got 2 more sessions coming up tomorrow. In the morning, we're coming back to the questions around funding. How do we fund the foundational economy? And in the afternoon, we're looking at national projects and the foundational economy. So I do hope lots of you are going to be able to come back again tomorrow and hear some more. But for all, that's it for today. So thank you very much again to our speakers, and see you tomorrow.